Welcome back after lunch. It's been a fantastic day so far, and we are really honored to have an expert panel to talk about the intersection between geopolitics and energy. And I guess a starting point for me as a reporter, I work for The Economist, I'm the geopolitics editor of The Economist. I remember those protests in 2003 before the invasion of Iraq saying, no war for oil, no blood for oil. And even if you sympathize with those sentiments, the truth is that it is coldly rational that countries go to war exactly for things like oil and energy, because you can argue that World War I, World War II were both in ways won by the side that had more oil. That was certainly the view of the Allies in World War I. The British Foreign Secretary said, we floated to victory on a tide of oil. And that was American oil. It was Britain, coal-fired British Empire, giving way to the American oil-powered superpower. And so these questions of geopolitics and energy are utterly inseparable. We're extremely lucky to have two people who have been the highest ranks of government looking at that, precisely that intersection. So we have in the middle Ambassador Bolton, needs no introduction, former UN ambassador, former national security advisor to President Trump in the first Trump presidency, and Jason Bordoff, now director of the Center for Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, but a special assistant in the Obama administration, senior director in the NSC for energy and climate change. And so two absolute practitioners of that nexus between energy, climate, national security, and geopolitics. So all of us have been watching the oil price affected to an incredible extent the last few days by what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz. Oil traders across the world trying to work out how to read the strikes that Iran made on Qatar. You saw the oil price moving in response to the levels of missiles flying through the sky. Both of you are inside government, working on energy, national security. Help us understand what is playing out in the White House, in the Pentagon, the State Department, the NSC right now, as they look at Iran and the Middle East. Of course, they're focused on the strikes on Fordo, on the nuclear sites, on the geopolitics. But how much is energy also playing into that? How much is the oil price, whether it's at the international, global level, or just the price of gas at the pump? How does that nexus between national security, politics, and energy play out in a crisis such as the one we're seeing in Iran? Ambassador, let's start with you.
Well, I think at the current time, there's not much strategic thinking going on in the White House, which is part of our problem. Don't get me wrong, there wasn't much going on when I was there either. And I think that reflects a real change from what for really since the beginning of World War II was a critical component of American strategic planning. I think it's obvious that the Middle East remains a source of hydrocarbons for most of the rest of the world. Its geography makes it ideally suited to do that. And I think people understand that if that changes in any significant way, economies in a wide variety of countries are going to suffer. Unfortunately, that doesn't bring our European friends to the right conclusion often enough. For example, when we were trying to stop the Houthis from closing the Suez Canal Red Sea maritime passage, the Brits and the French participated a little bit, and then they stopped, and as if it wasn't the responsibility of the rest of the Europeans to do something about it. The country that cares most about Middle East oil and gas is China. And they are potentially one of the big losers if the regime of the Ayatollahs falls. I think the Russians have a lot at stake as well because the ties between Beijing and Moscow, which I think form an emerging axis that will be the principal threat to the United States through the rest of this century, have rested on some of their outriders, including in the Middle East, Syria up until the fall of the Assad regime, and Iran. And so if the regime of the Ayatollahs goes, both Russia and China are severely disadvantaged. I do think energy plays a part of the calculus for the Trump administration because they are obsessed with the price of gasoline, and it's something that Trump saw as important in all three of his elections. I think he won in 2024 in substantial part because people were concerned about the inflation they saw, the continued high prices, the fear of those prices increasing. Gasoline has actually fallen over the past 5 months until the present crisis, but if it goes back up again, it's tangible evidence that things aren't working. So what they're really worried about is, I think, in my view, insufficiently the Iranian nuclear weapons threat, which has not been totally and completely obliterated, in case you missed that speech, and are more worried about gasoline prices in America than almost anything else that's going on over there.
And that's almost like a metaphor for the domestic focus of foreign policy, right? That all foreign policy is, there's always a domestic angle to things, but if you're worrying about the gas price, then that's a kind of...
Well, that has a particular significance and has ever since the Arab oil embargo of the 1970s. It's a concern that's never gone away. We could have eliminated a lot of that concern over several administrations if they hadn't been so anti-oil. Whether that concern has been eliminated, I kind of doubt by the current hostilities, but it's something the Trump administration will focus on. He keeps saying, drill, baby, drill. They're not going to do it until the prices get better, of course, but that is the answer.
Professor, drawing on your years in the Obama White House, when these crises broke, you were the energy guy. To what extent did you find yourself brought into all of these national security discussions?
Yeah, energy has, as you said, we floated to victory upon a wave of oil, energy security, going back to World War I, World War II, the Arab oil embargo. There's nothing new about the intersection of energy and geopolitics. And when we first thought about, with Congress passing laws to impose sanctions on Iran early in Obama's administration, the concern about what that would do to the global oil price was a very prevalent concern. So in the Obama administration, I assume in Bush, in Trump, certainly I'm sure the staff around President Biden was checking the gasoline price every day in the run-up to the election. It's a very sensitive economic and political issue. I do think it's kind of notable. This was supposed to be like the mother of all geopolitical risks to oil, the events we've seen play out over the last few weeks. And while oil prices did run up from the low 60s to nearly just about $80 a barrel, this is not 120, 140, the sort of nightmare scenarios. And if you were an oil trader and you decided to take a vacation at the start of the summer around June 11th or 12th and then came back 2 weeks later, you would not know anything happened, because oil prices are basically back to where they were before. And we could talk about exactly what transpired in those 2 weeks and why they all came down. But it is interesting to think about the fact that oil prices ran up. You didn't have to speculate on how the White House was thinking about that in the National Security Council, because President Trump was on Truth Social warning about high oil prices and telling the Department of Energy to drill, baby, drill, even though, as the ambassador said, those are market-driven decisions first and foremost. This is a market where we're in a pretty healthy supply situation. And I think there's generally like a disbelief in the oil markets now. They've kind of cried wolf so many times. People are just skeptical oil supply can be disrupted. And I think that comes to, well, 2 points. One is how energy markets have evolved in the half century since the Arab oil embargo. Which is, we responded to that energy crisis. The world looks very different today. We created the International Energy Agency. We had global interconnected oil markets. Oil was not traded as a global commodity. It was sold in long-term contracts between buyer and seller in the 1970s. You have a much more integrated system today. And that can create some risks, but there's a way in which it creates energy security as well. If you ask about the thinking in Iran, why didn't they try to close the Strait of Hormuz or attack Saudi oil infrastructure? Doing so might have imposed pain on the United States or Israel, or pushed up oil prices, or upset Trump. It would have hurt Iran. It would have hurt Iran's allies like China, that are the largest purchaser of Iranian oil. It would have hurt its Gulf Arab neighbors that it was trying to keep on its side. And so in a world that is more interconnected, there's a sort of level of security that comes from that as well. And we saw the same thing with Russia in the energy crisis after it invaded Ukraine. We saw Russia weaponize gas supply to Europe. It did not do that with oil. It depends a lot on oil revenue. And the United States and Europe did not sanction the export of Russian oil the way they did the export of Iranian oil, because that just would have hurt all of us too much in the process. And the last point I'll make is, as the ambassador said, we still get a lot of oil supply from the Middle East, and that still matters to the United States, and it wasn't supposed to be this way. If you go back I looked at this the other day, right after Iran last retaliated on U.S. bases following the assassination of Soleimani about 5 years ago. President Trump spoke about how we don't care what happens in the Middle East anymore. We're energy independent now. The U.S. went from importing 60% of our oil in 2006, 7 to being a net exporter today. We've had the shale revolution is the most stunning increase in oil production that any country has ever seen in history. And it is still a global interconnected market. The price is still set globally. If you're worried about gasoline prices, you still care a lot about what happens in the Middle East or the Strait of Hormuz, which is why it made little sense to me that the day after President Trump tweeted, "Bring gasoline prices down," he went on Truth Social to celebrate what Congress is now trying to do to pull back support for electric vehicles and fuel economy standards. If we want to increase our energy security, the best way to do that is to use less in the first place. And so that's something that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight, but you don't develop energy security just by producing more. It's even better to use less.
So that's fantastic. You jumped. I've got to scrap a couple of my questions because I was going to ask literally about that kind of China angle. We saw oil traders. I'm probably not allowed to quote the Financial Times because I work for The Economist, but there was a really interesting quote in the FT a couple of days ago. An oil trader literally saying that we don't think Iran is going to close the Strait of Hormuz because that will hurt China, and China is their only significant remaining ally. And that was a kind of argument that the interconnectedness that you just described so well should somehow impose kind of restraint. It makes it harder to use energy as a weapon without causing damage to either yourself or your allies. On that question of allies, Ambassador, can I ask you how you think today's America First foreign policy interacts with that idea of not just the oil price in the Middle East affecting the price of the pump here in Colorado, but also for so much of the 20th century, part of the alliance network that America led was also worrying about energy access for your allies, right? That one of the reasons that America policed the Persian Gulf was to make sure that there was energy available for your allies in Europe, because America always had a ton of energy, even if it wasn't as energy independent as perhaps you might have liked at some points. Now that we have President Trump saying that he really doesn't care about allies in the same way as previous American presidents have, does that free America from worrying about the supply of oil for others? Is this really an America First geopolitical play when it comes to energy, in addition to the very good point the professor made about how prices are all interconnected? In terms of the alliance loyalties, how does that work?
Well, I don't. It's hard to connect because you're giving what Trump's doing too much coherence. That's not the way he thinks about it. And in fact, the ability of the United States to export oil and gas actually is a huge strategic weapon for us if we would use it. If you ask Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, any of the countries in the East Asian sphere that depend on oil coming from the Gulf, through the Straits of Malacca, through the South China Sea, which, by the way, the Chinese have claimed as a province of China, meaning the South China Sea, which is roughly as large as the Mediterranean, is no longer international waters, it's Chinese territorial waters, which, if we allow that claim to persist, is bad news. But if you said to all those countries, buy our oil and gas, we would have huge new markets, they would be far more secure, and so would we. I think there are parts of the Trump administration that understand that, but that's not how they're thinking, as you can see from the consequences of the tariff policy. I just want to make one more point on China, though, if I could. The circumstance under which Iran would close the Strait of Hormuz is if we or the Israelis destroyed the major Iranian infrastructure on Karg Island and Bandar Abbas.
So their ability to export oil, effectively.
In other words, if we stop the Iranian ability to export, they would then try and close the Strait of Hormuz to say, if we can't do it, nobody can. And I think that would be significant. Many times the Gulf Arabs have said quietly, not publicly, which is the way we have the most fruitful conversations, look, if the Israelis are going to do something against Iran, just tell them to hit the nuclear program, because we'd like to see that disappear too. Don't hit their oil infrastructure, because that's going to be bad news for us. And it's sound advice.
Right. And we should remind the audience, and I'm sure many of you know this, but one of the geopolitical accidents of the world's geography is that the Strait of Hormuz is like 20 miles wide at the narrowest point.
Well, it's about two ship lanes in each direction with a
20% of the world's oil goes through that strait. So that to have Iran on the eastern shore of that, and then the Houthis, their allies, lobbing missiles is not easy. Let me ask you to tie in with Professor Bordorf made the good point about, you could also increase your energy security by having all of the above, looking at renewable energy and things. If you're looking at this from the perspective of America's allies, above all, I guess, Europe, the first half of the 20th century was Europe's great empires going out into the world trying to find oil so they would not be dependent on American oil or Russian imperial oil and then the Bolsheviks. That's why Iran ended up with the British causing all kinds of mayhem because we found oil there. Now Europe is extremely committed to trying to get itself off dependence on Russian gas and, if it can, oil, is willing to buy more American LNG, but that's not the whole story. So if you're a European policymaker right now, you're saying, actually, with a hostile Russia, we need to be as independent as we can be from Russian energy. There are some European leaders who would also say, we're not sure if America is a reliable friend in the same way, so maybe putting all of our bets on American LNG is also giving Trump even more leverage over us. So the only other play is to join that to your agenda to decarbonize, to go green. But the problem is, as senior officials have said to me in recent reporting, you cannot go green without China right now. There is no wind turbine you can buy that doesn't have at least a Chinese component in it. There is no solar farm you can build without Chinese components. So tell me how that looks from a geopolitical standpoint from Washington. And I know you come at this from very different positions because you're clearly very concerned about encouraging allies to go green, encouraging America to go green. Perhaps you have a slightly different focus on that. But tell us about the geopolitics of that you have allies like Europe who want to go green. It offers them geopolitical independence from certainly Russia, maybe for some also America, but the risk of dependence on China. How does that look for America? Is that a risk if your allies are dependent on China for green tech? And I start with the professor, and then I'll come to you, Ambassador.
Yeah, and I really would love to hear Ambassador Bolton's views on this, but there's so much in your question. But to start, I would say, where we started was Iran and the Middle East, and then you can go back a few years to Russia, and these are all a reminder that energy geopolitics is far from a thing of the past. I do think there's nothing new about energy security being the dominant primary focus of energy policy, but it has been a little different in the last 15 or 20 years, at least in advanced economies, where I think the conversation in the US, parts of the US and Europe often started with decarbonization and the energy transition. And look, I think we need to talk more, not less, about climate and the energy transition. But there were a couple of reasons why that happened. One is climate, in my view, is a crisis. But also, we sort of took energy security for granted. We became a little complacent. We had the shale revolution, this massive new surge in supply to the global market. Electricity demand, at least in the OECD, was relatively flat. Renewable costs, and renewables were growing very quickly because costs were falling 70, 80, 90%, largely because of what China was doing, which is now a bug, not a feature. And in the last couple of years, for a variety of reasons, higher costs of energy, concerns about competitiveness, like Mario Draghi's report in Europe, these crises we've seen with Russia, Ukraine, in the Middle East, energy security is back as the central concern. So if you're a European policymaker, like the new European Union Energy Commissioner, your mandate from Ursula von der Leyen, the EU president, is to do three things: go to net zero, bring Russian gas and then oil, bring Russian energy to zero, and bring energy prices down. And it's really hard to do all of those three things at the same time. So the question is, where does this new focus on energy security take you? What does it mean for climate? Does it mean we just don't care anymore? And I do think there are risks, but there are also interesting opportunities, because to your point, a focus on energy security will lead many countries to try to reduce trade in energy, reduce exposure to volatile global markets. As I just mentioned a minute ago, whether you're a net exporter or not, you're still dependent on a global market. And for places like Europe, which are import dependent for the most part for hydrocarbons, what would you do? You'd want to electrify more of your economy. You might want to rethink your position on nuclear power, which helps to give you that domestic electricity. Deploy a lot of renewables. We have to manage the intermittency and deal with storage. We need to diversify supply chains away from China, find ways to encourage investment for things like critical minerals in other parts of the world where China has a very dominant position. And if you go to like the emergency, the national energy emergency that President Trump declared on day one, it mostly wasn't about drill, baby, drill. It was about the state of the power grid, winning a competitive race with China for leadership in AI by meeting rapidly growing electricity demand, diversifying critical mineral supply chains and other parts of supply chains away from China. A lot of this might be the most pro-nuclear administration we've ever seen. It takes you to a lot of places that point in some of, not all of, and especially if you're in a place like India or Indonesia, coal is the big exception to that. There's a lot of energy security and jobs in coal, and that's not consistent with that position in the transition. But I think you're making an important argument, which is a new focus on energy security, while it has risks for what happens to the pace of the energy transition, which is not moving nearly fast enough, it is going to give greater motivation for many things that we're trying to do to reduce exposure to global markets and increase domestic energy production, electrify more of the economy. And there is a lot of overlap, including efficiency. Energy efficiency is something we've ignored for a long time. There's so much more to do there. I think now you could have the urgency of the energy transition and the urgency of energy security combining as potentially more powerful motivators to do many of those things. And Europe will be a case in point.
But to see your triangle of doom, I'll raise you another triangle of doom. If you're a European policymaker, you want to go green affordably, you want to preserve manufacturing industrial jobs in Europe, so you want to keep building cars and energy infrastructure in Europe, and you want to avoid dangerous dependency on China. And right now you can have two, not three.
Back to your
You can't do it. So, Ambassador, from the American perspective, whatever the government view is of climate change, if your European allies say, we are absolutely committed to going green, but by the way, that is going to mean Chinese-built cars in our garages, Chinese-built battery factories in Europe, we're going to be, with Chinese wind farms. How does the American administration, do they have a dog in that fight? Is that a national security concern?
Absolutely. So just let me say to begin with, I'm a great supporter of NATO, just to get that straight.
We didn't used to have to say that, did we? That's a new thing.
The Europeans have done this to themselves. I mean, I'm not sympathetic. Ronald Reagan told Margaret Thatcher during his administration, do not become dependent on Russian oil and gas. Said it to all the Europeans. They didn't listen. Gerhard Schroeder, former Chancellor of Germany, goes on the boards of Russian energy companies. And then people wonder why the Germans are so worried about Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2. They did this to themselves. They've done this to themselves on China, too. So, wow, what a big market. That's clearly something we have to get into. Now they're suffering from it both on the import and the export side. So, they didn't listen to the advice in the first place. They've done extraordinarily foolish things, Germany being the prime example in saying they're going to get off nuclear energy. The country in the world that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but at least among industrial democracies, the country that relied most on nuclear energy for its power was Sweden. Which was pacifist, for God's sakes, up until it joined NATO. And yet the pacifist Swedes were able to survive and have one of the best environmental records in Europe because they used nuclear energy. This to me is fairly straightforward. But in the mess you're in now in Europe, where your energy costs are adversely affecting your production cost of everything you build, making it non-competitive except opening to the Chinese, you've got to make some hard choices. The American ability to export oil and gas to Europe is almost limitless. And I think what the Europeans should understand, and I think some do and some don't, is that the direction the Trump administration has taken American policy is not guaranteed after his term of office ends. Trump remains an aberration. I think the effect of the tariffs and other things will take its toll, and American dependence to sell oil and gas, which would create powerful incentives in the United States, political incentives as well as economic incentives not to disrupt it, would be a protective force. The Biden administration wanted to increase American dependence on foreign energy sources, in part, including perhaps importing from Venezuela, even allowing the Maduro regime to stay in power because it didn't want to increase the domestic political power of the oil industry. And I just think this has put us in the wrong direction for many respects. A lot of what people want to do in avoiding carbon-based fuel sources depends on batteries and all of the rare earths. We've got plenty of rare earth in the United States. We're prevented by environmental restrictions from tapping it. Where did they recently find one of the biggest rare earth concentrations unknown before? In Sweden. Now, they're pacifists, they're environmentalists, they're just about as liberal as you can get. Those Swedes are going to exploit that rare earth. And we're going to sit here and say, goodness, what are we going to do? So there's plenty of energy actually in Europe if they wanted to tap it, if they wanted to drill for oil, if they wanted to try for shale in Great Britain and Poland. They make these rules and then say, we have no alternative but to go to China. There are plenty of alternatives.
So you're surely right that it was dumb to close down the nuclear power in Germany. That was one of Angela Merkel's kind of great blunders. And you're surely right that there will be something of an all and above response from many countries. But if a European leader in their negotiations right now with the Trump administration, with the Atlantic Alliance relationship in such a frayed state, if they say, by the way, we do need to go green, and that is going to involve building huge wind farms or solar farms, which will involve Chinese components, is that going to be a national security issue for the American government? Are they going to start saying to not just the Europeans, but all of their allies, cut China out of your energy grids? How important a national security issue was that when you were in government?
Well, it wasn't much of a focus then. I think it should become a focus, but I think the Europeans generally are behind the U.S. in appreciating really the whole of society threat that we face from China over the rest of the century. I think in places like Japan, they know exactly what it is. I think the same is true in Australia and New Zealand. We have come to it slowly, although I think we understand it better. But a lot of Europeans don't. And even if they're told that, I think a lot of them will not listen to it.
Can we broaden this out as well beyond Europe to the rest of the world? I'm very struck, and Professor Bordoff, you work on climate policy now at Columbia. In my travels as my new geopolitics geek, I was in China for 6 years until the end of last year, but now I've gone kind of global. I am very struck by country after country. I was just in South Africa by, I guess as a journalist, you would call it a kind of green backlash, a climate backlash. In South Africa, people would say to me, we believe in climate change, we believe in trying to go green, but we have electricity blackouts, we have expensive energy, we need growth, we have a stagnant economy. You just need to cut us a break, particularly the European Union, which is threatening to tariff any product that has a high carbon content. You need to just let us burn coal for 10 years. Give us a break. We have no choice here. In Europe, you have huge political protests when we try to raise, Emmanuel Macron and the Gilets jaunes protests were about a carbon tax on fuel. Britain has incredibly expensive electricity. It's a political issue. Professor, we're talking, so many countries now are saying, we believe in climate change, we're not climate denialists, but our energy is expensive, our public is furious. Cut us a break. We've got other things to worry about. We need to raise our defense spending, too much on our plates. Just let's forget the climate stuff for a bit. That is, I hear that in so many countries. As someone who's involved in climate policy, are you alarmed by that? How do you respond to that?
I think it's, as I said a moment ago, a risk, but also an opportunity because it is a reality. If we fail at providing energy security, affordability, the first thing that's going to evaporate is support for a faster transition. The goal of energy policy is to deliver energy affordably and reliably and securely to people. And we have gone about the energy transition in some ways that I think have made those problems worse rather than better. So it's not surprising at all that that would be the case. And you're talking in particular, the question you asked was not just about Europe, but about emerging and developing economies. I just got back from India, that understandably say, don't look at more than 90% of future emissions growth will come from emerging and developing economies. But climate change is caused, the impacts are a result of cumulative emissions over time, not the annual flow of emissions. And most of, they're sitting there saying, we didn't cause this problem. So wealthy countries that are responsible for most of the historic emissions to date need to do much more to drive their emissions down. And the timeframes may look different there for countries with rapid growth. India, for example, has an incredibly ambitious goal to get to 500 gigawatts of solar by 2030. To do that, they would need to take the best year they've ever had for solar deployment, triple that amount, and do that every year between now and 2030. And if they can achieve that Herculean task, coal use will be higher in 2030 than it is today. because that's what happens when you take the largest population in the world and grow the population and grow GDP. Now, it's also true, when I was sitting in India, that the concern about dependence on China was as great or greater there as what you hear in Washington or Brussels. And that comes back to the point about these clean energy supply chains. And the question you asked a moment ago about how we should think about China is, I think, the most important question today. That's not well thought through. That is, we need more of a nuanced discussion about, both in the developed world, in the OECD, and in emerging markets. The Senate just put forth a new version of the Inflation Reduction Act, of the One Beautiful Bill, that repeals parts of the IRA. I think they're voting on that tomorrow. It now taxes solar and wind unless you meet certain threshold requirements for how much of the components come from China, because depending on China is seen as a national security risk. And it is, as Ambassador Bolton said, we should recognize the legitimate risks that apply to the fact that 70, 80, 90% of supply chains depend on China. But I do think we're taking kind of energy security in the traditional sense. Where does the daily flow of oil come from? The mentality that emerged from the Arab oil embargo that someone could cut off supply to you. And we're sort of applying it to everything. And the way it looks for heavy rare earths that are used for magnets with sensitive military application is different, I think, than what it looks like for a solar panel, which is a cheap manufactured product. Once it's installed, it produces solar. You can't cut off the flow of that solar. You could cut off supply chains for installation of new solar and cause cost inflation or delays in those supply chains. We're not buying electricity from China, we're buying products that make it. And I'm not saying there's zero risk there, there is, including cybersecurity risk. But I think the general sense that China cannot be part of any supply chain is just the scale and magnitude of their dominant position is so incomprehensible to think about how one would challenge and replicate. You can't get there alone with like sending U.S. LNG to Europe. I mean, so
Ambassador, how would you respond to that? And just to add a tiny bit onto that, I was just in Latin America where people say, yes, America is telling us not to do so many deals with China, but if you're the Brazilian government, you have very large hydroelectric dams. You have to get electricity across enormously long distances, which require these very, very high voltage power lines. China is incredibly good at that. State Grid Corporation of China is the third largest company in the world by revenues. Most people have never heard of it, but it's going out there in the global south, building these incredibly smart grids to carry electricity in very long distances. How does America, if I assume you do think that America really needs to make sure it's competing with China for kind of influence and to push back China's sway in some of these countries, in the energy context, China is not just building solar panels, it's doing all these grids and smart grids that are just meeting a need that America is not well set up to meet right now. You don't have the same technologies. When you were looking at national security, how did that play out into the US-China competition? What part of that did energy play?
Well, China is able to do this, and it's not just in energy, it's in a wide range of things, because through things like the Belt and Road Initiative, it's subsidizing its firms that are out there doing it. It's using what we call debt financing to try and trap governments, which would largely pay for infrastructure projects, since most electrical companies in almost all third world countries are state-owned. It gets the governments caught up in what looks to be very attractive financing at the front end of a deal, and it has catastrophic effects at the back end of a deal. And I'll guarantee, whether it's Donald Trump or a Democratic president in 28, we're not going to compete on that basis. What it should tell us is this is the way China operates, and it's why we have to take the 360-degree picture of the threat of China. It doesn't mean we respond to them in each and every way that they react out there. We find the places where we're going to be superior and not compete in this bottomless pit where they're subsidizing their contractors.
So I don't want to forget, I'm very keen, for the last question before we get to the audience, I'll be asking about AI and the energy needs of that. But I just want to, before we get to that, on Russia, one of the puzzles I have had when I've seen President Trump explaining his desire to have Vladimir Putin in from the cold, to have a reconciliation of some sort with Russia. Part of that is he talks about the amazing deals that America can do with Vladimir Putin's Russia. And I find myself wondering what those would be, because, in the famous phrase of people like the late Senator McCain, Russia is a gas station with nukes, right? It's basically a basket case economy that has hydrocarbons to sell. Well, the last time I checked, America is not in need of Russian oil and gas. So I know I'm asking you to rationalize the president, which is not always easy, but when he talks of these gigantic deals with Russia, what do you think what does he have in mind, and is energy part of that?
Well, I think he has in mind the reason he made Rex Tillerson Secretary of State, to Rex's ultimate dismay, is that he remembers that Exxon and other major oil companies around the world went into Russia. They developed the resources, and now they're wondering why they did it. That era is gone. I think that there's really no chance of it. And I think he says all these things because this is how Trump sees foreign policy. It's through personality. It's not about geostrategy. He thinks he and Vladimir Putin are friends, and he wants to do business with his friend. What's hard to understand?
So before we go to questions from the audience, I don't want to forget to mention the extraordinary link between energy, geopolitics, and AI, because we have, I was just talking to someone over the lunch break who's involved in AI in the Gulf. You have these huge data centers that the Gulf is hosting because they have, extremely good very low energy costs. How does that fit into the world of national security and energy? You have these, AI ambitions which are going to need just staggering quantities of electricity here in the States, but also it will determine where these AI centers go. So I'll start with Professor Baldoff, and then I'll come to you, Ambassador. Help us understand, Professor, how, if you're sitting in Washington, or if you're an American responsible citizen who's excited by the outlook for AI, how does energy fit into that? How does national security fit into that?
I'll make one quick comment, because you asked about Russia before, and you made a comment that the U.S. doesn't need Russian oil anymore. And what we saw in the last few years is that's not true. It's the reason Russian oil wasn't sanctioned. And what the U.S. government tried to do was put a new kind of fangled policy in place called a price cap, which said, as long as you sell your oil, we need the oil, but let's try to reduce how much money Putin makes as a result of it. Because if you were actually to cut off that supply, to our earlier conversation, you would have pushed up oil prices in the process. And we can come back to how we think about, I think the possibility that Russian gas goes up, not down, to Europe, despite what's happening in Brussels right now, is something that is probably a higher risk than some people perceive. You asked about AI, and I think it's really critically important for the energy sector now in two respects. One is how much energy AI needs, and the other is what AI can do as a tool for the energy sector. And so there's a lot of discussion now about how power-intensive AI is. It's 10x to do a chat GPT search for something than to use Google. It's just incredibly electricity intensive, the needs for these data centers. Electricity demand for data centers, according to the International Energy Agency, is going to roughly double by 2030. That sounds like a big number. Electricity demand for data centers is around 2% of total electricity demand. If you look at the projected growth globally in electricity demand between now and 2030, less than 10% of that is projected to come from the needs of AI and data centers. Air conditioning will require more electricity than that in terms of growth in electricity demand between now and 2030. So it is important to put it in context. Now, it is localized. So in places in the US, in Virginia, it's going to strain the grid and be a challenge in certain places. And that's why we've seen a sort of renewed interest, particularly in nuclear power, but we're seeing these massive tech companies that for them it's existential. Where are we going to get the power for these data centers? Google, Meta, et cetera, really putting real capital with the CapEx budgets they have and the green commitments they have to really sign deals that are, I think, exciting for what we might see to meet rising electricity demand in this country, and do it, yes, with natural gas, but also with renewables, also with geothermal, also with nuclear power. And I think that's really consequential and important. I think the second thing I would say is we should recognize how much uncertainty there is around this. You could fill up this tent with papers written in the late 1990s about how the internet was going to consume all of US electricity over a certain number of years. I remember an op-ed in Forbes from 1999 called "Dig More Coal, the PCs are coming." And of course, that never happened because technology gets more efficient. We figure out how to use energy more efficiently because you have economic incentives to do that. Same was true with cryptocurrency and innovations there and how that crypto mining is done. So I think we should just recognize the enormous uncertainty, and maybe these numbers are not going to be as big as some think. I think in the long run, the potential for AI to really be a transformative tool for the energy sector is even more exciting. Artificial intelligence to help with predictive weather modeling that increase the output from renewables, dynamic line rating that can push more electricity through existing transmission lines. It's an incredibly powerful tool, and I think in the long run, if you're concerned from a climate standpoint, the possibility that AI might accelerate the pace of clean energy and bring those costs down may, in the long run, I actually think is more likely to offset any negative impacts from rises in emissions because you need more power now, like the build-out we're seeing in natural gas plants in this country.
Well, thank you for some long-term hope, but short-term concerns about where AI centers are based?
Yeah, I wouldn't put them in the Gulf states, that's for sure. I'd keep them in the United States for obvious reasons.
And is that partly a China thing, or is that just about having them too far away?
Look, our security is not perfect here, as we see on a daily basis, but I'd much rather have it here than someplace where we're not in control of the security.
So let's go to questions from the audience. I don't know how many microphones. We have one microphone, two microphones. Great. So we'll take 2 or 3 questions. There's a gentleman right at the back and one in the middle here.
Thank you. Great conversation, and heard you speak a lot on renewables and nuclear and oil. I'd like to see if you can take it deeper on natural gas. If you think about the grid breakdown in Spain and Portugal, a month or 2 ago, it put a lot of emphasis on grid inertia and the importance of harmonics in the grid as well. We know that combined cycle turbine helps maintain it. And we also know things like the Chinese long transport fleet for heavy trucks is going toward LNG, which exposes them in a certain way. And then finally, to trade, thinking about this, seems like the easiest way for countries to balance their trade with us would be to strike a deal to import LNG, which is an immediate effect. Why isn't natural gas getting more focus in this conversation?
So maybe we'll, because that was you sneaked in 3 questions there in a very very effectively sneaky way. So take your pick. We have the natural gas role in the very complex grid breakdown in Spain. That was a really shocking event down there. We have China using LNG in trucks, and we have the ability of America to be the kind of the unlimited supplier of LNG to fix some of these trade wars. So take your pick between those.
I'll just answer the one on China if I can. Look, this is something that China's been thinking about a lot, and one readily available source and a very good answer for them is just take more oil and gas from Russia. They have to build new pipeline capacity. That's exactly what they're talking about. They would de-risk having to lift oil and gas from the Persian Gulf, sail it across the Indian Ocean, which may be a pretty hostile body of water to them in short order, and that would be a big plus for them. So I could easily see them trying to do more on natural gas because they think they're going to get it from Russia. And
they're driving an incredibly hard bargain. You've even seen Vladimir Putin say in public, the Chinese, they're tough negotiators because they're demanding, they know that Russia doesn't have many alternatives right now.
It's tough being a satellite to a communist.
Professor.
And there was an FT article 2 or 3 days ago to that effect, that China was rethinking the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline, an important potential new piece of infrastructure between Russia and China, as they see potential risk to gas supplies from the Middle East because of what might happen to the Strait of Hormuz and LNG exports. We talk a lot about the Strait of Hormuz and oil, but it's a really important channel for LNG, particularly from Qatar. And for those who were interested in what Ambassador Bolton just said, the most recent paper on the website of the Center on Global Energy Policy is about how China will respond in terms of its relations with Russia because of what happened in the Middle East from an energy standpoint. I think the question more broadly about natural gas and LNG, this idea that it can sort of help with the trade negotiations with different countries, to some extent that's true. I think it's also important to just keep that stuff in context. President Trump, maybe in April, said Europe could get a waiver from all these tariffs if they buy $350 billion in energy from the United States. That is a volume that is 4 times Europe's total gas consumption today. You would need to import as LNG from the United States to get to $350 billion. So, we saw this last time, that there were deals signed, but as the ambassador said earlier, the decision about where U.S. LNG goes are one's market makes, not one's governments make. It's not up to the European Commission. It depends on the price of LNG. And the U.S. has played a super important role in delivering energy security to Europe following Russia's weaponization of pipeline gas exports. And that's just going to depend on, year by year, Europe is less dependent on Russia now. By the way, they're still importing about 1/3 as much gas from Russia as they did before. It's not zero, and so that's still important. And they're trying to bring that down. Whatever the weather is, if it's exceptionally cold, gas demand goes up. Year to year, when they try to fill their inventories, they're going to go into now a global market. They're less dependent on Russia, but they're more vulnerable to the volatility of the global LNG market. And so if prices justify sending LNG from the US to Europe, it'll happen. And if not, because gas demand is lower one year, it'll go to Asia or something else instead. And the outlook for gas really just depends on the price. I mean, I think at very high LNG prices, you start to look at other alternatives like renewables or coal, and then you see more tepid demand growth. But if you have a lot of supply, and the U.S. is going to is already, even under Biden, was going to be doubling how much LNG capacity we have, with a lot of new supply coming that might bring prices down, demand will be pretty healthy for gas, and it's playing a really important role domestically in meeting rising AI needs as well.
So we had a question down here.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I'll start with a quick comment for context that we'll get to a single question. Just by background, I run a commodity futures exchange in Singapore, and I was on the Goldman Sachs commodity desk before that. So my clients are the firms like Trafigura and Vitol and Mercuria that trade, these products. One thing that I think it's critically important to understand is that these commodity desks are less and less, caring about oil medium term. The oil. Particularly as oil becomes a byproduct in the United States. We're so used to oil geopolitics for 75 years. Gas and copper is basically where all these desks are focused.
That's a great point in your question.
And so the question is exactly on copper. Copper plays into all the energy, AI, energy transition. Is there, just your view on how, has that made it to the top of the list of the administration? Because I think the commodity traders think.
Thank you.
Answer no.
Professor?
It hasn't made it to the top of the list. We have seen more discussion of it. Trump has said he wants to accelerate resolution copper in Arizona. I was just in Chile visiting one of the largest open pit copper mine in the world. And the idea that the Development Finance Corporation, which was created by the Trump administration the first time, might be a tool to help encourage investment, including for US companies in copper and other parts of the world to diversify away from China. It's hard to comprehend how dramatic the growth in copper needs are going to be. Nevertheless, if we try to meet our net zero goals and electrify everything, I mean, the amount of copper in an electric vehicle is staggering.
But it is fascinating seeing, and we have a question down here if we get the mic, so many governments now, when they see the Trump administration, they bring with them a list of minerals. We currently sell these to China, but we could sell them to you. I mean, that was the South African offer. You just saw the DRC in Africa get a peace deal in a war.
But all of this is then mined, like in Chile, and then sent to China to be refined and processed.
Sure, which is partly to do with electricity costs in Africa. And let's take this question here.
Ambassador Bolton and Professor Bordoff, how much time do you spend worrying about 400 kilograms of missing enriched uranium in Iran? And you made the joke, Ambassador Bolton, about the total obliteration. What do you think about centrifuge capacity at this point as well?
Well, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency said that their analysis was that of the roughly 15,000 centrifuges at at Natanz, that probably a substantial part of them are inoperable forever. These are very delicate machines. It doesn't take much to mess them up. There are only about 3,000 centrifuges at Fordo. I think they're buried for a good long time because the Israelis can close the entry shafts again when the Iranians try and go back in. There's undoubtedly some capacity to enrich, but a couple hundred centrifuges isn't going to make a big difference in the big picture. And the bulk of the uranium, the enriched uranium that's missing, is in the form of uranium hexafluoride. It's a gas. To make a nuclear weapon, you have to have uranium metal, which means you need to convert from a gas back into uranium metal. I think those facilities' conversion, both from yellow cake to gas and gas back to metal, are probably destroyed. And then you have to have the weaponization capability to turn the metal into whether it's a gun design or a hollow sphere, and I think those capabilities are largely gone too. I'd like to get all of the uranium, I'd like to get all of their equipment, I'd like to put it right next to the Libya nuclear weapons program at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. That's where it belongs. Whether we've got the fortitude to go for that or not, I don't know.
So, Professor, you have 15 seconds to tell us about whether you're worried by nuclear annihilation.
Certainly, I'm interested and worried in understanding where the stocks of highly enriched uranium are, which is related to, but not the same as how long it might take them to reconstitute their program, and whether this has to be a repeat event where every couple of years military strikes like this are needed, and what the implications for that is in the region, and how the rest of the Gulf thinks about that.
Thank you so much. We've covered an amazing amount of ground. Great panel. Thank you for the questions.